So let's talk about another reason why a person might be deviant, and it's called labeling theory. People respond to the labels they are given. And maybe a person might be deviant if they're given a bad label. For example, there's a movie called The Outsiders. It's also a book. Some of you have read the book. Some of you have seen the movie. Some of you have done both. Now, in the book, these are the greasers. Now, not all of them were bad, but you could see why if someone is labeled bad, well, then maybe I'll just go ahead and do bad things. If you're labeling me as a greaser and you're saying that I'm a bad person, well, then maybe I'll just go through with it. I remember in kindergarten, I had one of my classmates was told by the teacher, and this was in kinder, the teacher said, "Ivan, you're so weird. I don't know why you're so weird." Well, if the teacher is telling you that you are weird, well, then maybe you will go ahead and act weird because that's how you're being labeled. And it's very powerful, especially with little children, if you label them as lazy or dumb, and maybe the label will stick. Just like if you label a child as so fantastic and so smart, maybe that child will grow up to be spoiled. And that's the power of labeling theory. Alright, so now we're going to look at this little formula right here. And this formula is going to end up with a theory. So let's say people are told to achieve goals, wealth, status, okay, little arrow. But maybe they don't have access to the institutionalized means, meaning it just means school or work. So if people are told to get this, but they don't have access to this, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is they're going to feel like they're alienated. In sociology, it's anomie. If a person feels this and they're going to feel this, and that would be a very bad thing. And that leads us to this theory called strain theory. It's when people cannot achieve goals legally. Well, if you feel a lot of strain and if you're feeling alienated and you can't get wealth and status because of school and work, then we're going to give up on trying to get those goals legally. And what's the opposite of getting goals legally? Well, maybe you'll do things that are not legal. Okay, so let's look at anomie's 4 deviant paths. There are 4 things that could happen if you feel like you're alienated. Okay, here's a gangster, Al Capone. Al Capone wanted wealth and status, right? However, he didn't go to school. So one of the categories, they're called innovators - criminals. And your example is Al Capone. So one of the deviant paths that you could take is you could become a criminal, or an innovator, if you will. This is the hand of a Japanese gangster. If you notice, they cut off his finger. Here again, you see a Japanese gangster whose fingers were cut off because they made a mistake and they did something in the mafia that maybe they shouldn't have done. These are fake fingers, and these fingers are made so that they can put them here and fit in with society after they've left the mafia. It's called yubitsumi, the removal of a finger by the Yakuza gang for failure of some kind. So, make sure you know the term innovator, criminal, the example, Al Capone. Alright, that's one of the deviant paths. What's another one that could happen? Let's look at ritualism. When you give up on goals and burnout occurs, for example, bad cops or bad teachers, when they started their job, maybe they had these really high goals, but then they realize the goals are not realistic and they get burnt out. So they stop trying and they're just working for their check. That's what ritualism is, when they give up. Another example might be politicians. Maybe they had good intentions to be a politician, but they saw that it was not realistic, and they're just there to get a check. So here's the second deviant path, ritualism. Alright, here's a check. Let's look at a third deviant path. So if you feel like you're alienated, maybe you're just going to retreat. And you're going to reject society's goals. And you could decide to be homeless. Or an underachiever. You're not really going to try. Some people are homeless because they decide they don't want to participate in life. Or even the subculture that we were talking about from Japan. These girls, they're not even really wanting to try and focus on a career or anything else. They're just focusing on playing. This is referred to as retreatism, rejecting society's goals. Example, homeless or underachievers. The last form of people that feel alienated, or again that term anomie, are people that become rebels. And in this case, rebels is a good thing. I'm talking about rebelling against something that is broken. Sometimes rebellion needs to happen if something is corrupt. Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King. This is a symbol for Black pride in the 1960s. This is a symbol that represents rebelling against the government. This is for Cesar Chavez. This was his symbol. Even the Hunger Games, they're rebelling. Rebellion, replacing goals with new ones. Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King. So in this term, rebellion is actually good because you're rebelling against something that is broken. Now, let's talk about deviance in a bad form. I said deviance can be very good. That is true. However, deviance can also be bad. Now, in reference to deviance being bad, let's look at some serial killers. This is a serial killer. His name is Richard Klinsky. This is a serial killer. His name is Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez was known as the Night Stalker because he primarily killed at night. Richard Klinsky was known as the Iceman because he would put the people that he killed, he would put them in a freezer that he owned. He owned a warehouse. He would rent a warehouse, and in the warehouse there was a freezer. And he would keep the bodies in the freezer for a long time. And then he would go dump the body because people weren't looking for a body 7 months later, or 10 months later, or 1 year later. Now, when it comes to deviating like this, a couple of things to keep in mind. At what point does someone become a serial killer? What is the number? How many numbers does it take to become a serial killer? There is an actual number. Make sure you know serial killer, a person with 3 or more isolated kills based on psychological gratification, meaning they have to kill in order to satisfy an urge that they have. They have an urge and they feel like they need to kill in order to satisfy that urge. Richard Ramirez born in El Paso. He moved to Los Angeles. He was not a typical serial killer because he was Mexican. Richard Kuklinski. He also was not a typical serial killer because he actually also worked for the mafia. He was a hitman. And although he was paid to kill, that is true, he also killed simply because he had an urge and he needed to fulfill a psychological gratification. So these are two of the more famous serial killers. Now, what do serial killers have in common? Well, they have animal cruelty when they are children. They tend to play with fire. And it says here also that when they are children, they are bedwetters. Now, I don't mean any little kid any child that wets the bed is going to be a serial killer. No, I'm talking about wetting the bed after you're, the age of 9. If you're 9, 10, 11, and 12, that's not typical. And that's usually the sign of some sort of trauma, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. So wetting the bed past a certain age is actually a sign sometimes that there is some psychological trauma. And it's called the McDonald Triad. The other thing that you need to know, this is a picture of Richard Ramirez when he was in the newspaper. And that's how they caught him, from this picture. A woman he was trying to kill, she escaped. And she went to the police department and they drew his picture. They put this in the newspaper and that's how they found him.